Have you ever woken up from a dream so vivid that your body feels as though it has physically been there? Your skin tingles with the cold of the night you've just escaped, and your chest heaves like you've been running for your life. My name is Elric Hensley, and I am a folklorist, someone whose days are spent unraveling the myths and legends that time has buried. But no amount of research or fieldwork could have prepared me for the story I'm about to share. What started as an ordinary night of restless sleep turned into a journey through a nightmare so horrifying, I still feel its tendrils wrapping around my mind. This isn't just a story about a bad dream. It's a doorway into something much darker. And before I lead you down that path, I need you to understand one thing. Once you've seen the village, you can never truly leave it behind. So, if you're someone who thrives on uncovering the unknown and standing on the edge of fear, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You'll want to be here for what comes next because this tale is more than a recount of terror. It's a warning. The dream began on a night without stars, without even the faintest sliver of the moon. The kind of night where the world feels as though it's holding its breath, where shadows press against your windows, eager to slip inside. I remember lying in bed, staring into the suffocating darkness of my room, my eyes refusing to close. There was a weight in the air, an inexplicable heaviness that made me feel like I wasn't alone. Then, without warning, it happened. One moment I was in my room, and the next, I was standing in the middle of a place I had never seen but somehow recognized. A village, silent and cloaked in fog so thick it clung to my skin like a living thing. The houses were old, their wooden beams warped and blackened as if burned by some long-forgotten fire. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, and every breath felt like inhaling centuries of forgotten despair. But what struck me most was the stillness, the kind that doesn't just quiet your surroundings but silences the very beat of your heart. Then came the sound, a faint, mournful hum, like a wind chime swaying in a storm that I couldn't feel. It was distant, yet it seemed to echo inside my skull, drawing me deeper into the village. I couldn't stop myself from walking, my feet moving as though the ground itself pulled me forward. As I ventured further, I saw shadows flickering in the windows of the houses, shapes that moved unnaturally, as though the people inside were trapped in some kind of grotesque loop. I wanted to turn back, to wake up, but I couldn't. My body no longer belonged to me. It was as if I had been swallowed whole by the dream, and the village wasn't ready to let me go. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but the more I tried to resist, the deeper I seemed to sink into the nightmare. The silence, the oppressive fog, the unseen eyes that I could feel watching me, all of it coiled around my chest like a predator waiting to strike. And then, from the depths of the mist, I saw it. A figure, standing motionless at the edge of the square, its outline blurred, but its presence unmistakable. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze burning into me, colder than the fog and darker than the night itself. This was no ordinary dream. This was something else, something alive. And as I took one reluctant step closer, I knew I wasn't just dreaming, I was trespassing. It started like any other restless night, the kind where the air feels too heavy, and sleep clings to the edges of your consciousness like a fleeting shadow. I closed my eyes, expecting nothing more than the usual kaleidoscope of fragmented dreams. But this time, something was different. I felt myself falling, not physically, but in a way that made my stomach twist and my heart race, as though I was being pulled into something deep and uncharted. When the sensation stopped, I found myself standing in a village I had never seen before, yet its presence felt hauntingly familiar. The air was thick, almost suffocating, carrying a strange, metallic tang that stung my throat. The fog swirled around my feet like living tendrils, whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. Each step I took on the cobblestone ground sent a hollow echo into the silence, a silence so complete that it felt unnatural, as though the world had forgotten how to make sound. The village was desolate, its crooked houses leaning, as if they bore the weight of centuries of sorrow. The wood of their walls was blackened, charred in some places, as if fire had once ravaged this place but left it frozen in its destruction. A faint breeze stirred, carrying with it a peculiar scent, a blend of damp earth, decayed wood, and something faintly sweet like overripe fruit. It was a smell that seemed to cling to my skin, sinking into my lungs with each breath. But then came the sound, a low, mournful hum, like the distant wail of a wind chime caught in a storm. It wasn't coming from any particular direction. Instead, it seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The sound wrapped around me, seeping into my bones, filling me with a dread so profound it made my knees weak. My gaze darted around the village, searching for the source, but all I saw were shadows, shadows that seemed to move just beyond the edge of my vision. The deeper I ventured, the stranger the village became. The houses, though empty, seemed alive. Their windows glowed faintly, not with light, but with an unnatural, pulsating darkness that seemed to draw me closer. The doors creaked on their hinges, as though inviting me inside, yet I dared not enter. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back, to wake up, but the dream held me captive, its grip unrelenting. Then I noticed something peculiar. A faint sense of déjà vu washed over me, as though I had walked these streets before, tread these same cobblestones. I couldn't explain it, but the village felt like an echo of a memory I couldn't quite grasp. The fog thickened, obscuring the path ahead, and as I moved forward, I felt a presence. It was subtle at first, a slight pressure in the air, a whisper of something unseen. But it grew stronger, more oppressive, until I could no longer ignore it. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the village square. It was indistinct, shrouded in mist, but its form was unmistakably human. It didn't move, yet its gaze bore into me, cold and unrelenting, even though I couldn't see its eyes. My heart pounded as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no logic in this place, no reason. The figure remained still, a silent sentinel in a village of shadows, yet its presence screamed louder than any voice. A strange pull urged me forward, a compulsion I couldn't resist. The closer I moved, the heavier the air became, and with each step, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. The cobblestones no longer felt solid, they felt like ash, crumbling underfoot. The hum grew louder, a dissonant melody that vibrated in my skull, drowning out my thoughts. I reached the village square, and as I did, the figure vanished, dissolving into the fog like a wisp of smoke. But its absence didn't bring relief. Instead, it left behind a deeper, more consuming fear, the kind that comes when you realize you're not just lost, but watched. Whatever this village was, it wasn't a place meant for the living, and I was trespassing. The village seemed to tighten its grip on me as I continued to explore, its silence growing heavier, almost tangible, like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. Each step I took felt like a trespass, as though the ground itself resented my presence. The air was unnervingly still, yet I could feel the faintest brush of something cold against my skin, as though unseen hands grazed my arms in warning. The cobblestones beneath my feet felt different now, softer, almost spongy, as if the village itself was alive and shifting beneath me. The houses loomed taller the deeper I ventured, their crooked roofs stretching into the mist like skeletal fingers clawing at the heavens. Windows that should have been empty glimmered faintly with an unnatural light, as if something was moving just behind the glass. My eyes caught glimpses of fleeting shadows, too quick and shapeless to define, yet unmistakably there. It wasn't just the houses, everything seemed to watch me. The trees at the edge of the village swayed gently, though there was no wind, and their bare branches curled inward like twisted claws. I approached a small, decrepit bench in what looked like the remains of a town square. As I reached out to touch its cracked surface, a sound shattered the oppressive silence, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound wasn't coming from any specific direction. It seemed to echo all around me, bouncing off the lifeless walls and disappearing into the fog. My heartbeat quickened, each thud resounding louder in the stillness. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from within the fog itself. It spoke no language I recognized, yet its tone was clear, hostile, invasive, and filled with malice. I spun around, searching for its source, but the fog only grew thicker, swallowing the narrow streets and twisting them into an unrecognizable labyrinth. My sense of direction was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear that I might never find my way out. Suddenly, I noticed something strange. The shadows cast by the flickering lights inside the houses were moving, but not in ways that made sense. They twisted and contorted, stretching long and thin like grotesque figures clawing their way across the walls. Some seemed to pause, turning toward me, their shapes pulsing as if they were alive. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a product of my imagination, but deep down I knew better. As I stumbled forward, the oppressive sensation of being watched became unbearable. My skin prickled with the weight of unseen eyes, and every instinct in me screamed to leave. But where could I go? The fog had consumed the path behind me, and the village seemed endless, a maze of identical houses and darkened alleys that defied logic. It felt as though I was being herded, guided towards something I couldn't yet see. Then I saw it, a door slightly ajar with a faint, pulsating light spilling out from the crack. It stood at the end of a narrow alley, the walls on either side leaning inward as if to trap me. My legs moved on their own, each step hesitant but unstoppable, driven by a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. The closer I got, the louder a strange noise became, a wet, squelching sound, like something heavy and alive shifting just beyond the door. I reached out with a trembling hand, the wood of the door warm beneath my fingers, almost pulsing like a heartbeat. As I pushed it open, the light grew blinding, and for a moment, all I could see was its brilliance. When my vision cleared, what lay inside made my blood run cold. The room was empty, yet filled with an unbearable sense of wrongness. The walls were covered in symbols, etched deep into the wood, glowing faintly as though alive. At the center of the room stood a single featureless figure, its form rippling like black smoke caught in a vortex. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to warp and twist, pulling me closer. My legs refused to respond, locked in place as the fog seeped into the room, wrapping itself around me. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, though still incomprehensible. Whatever this place was, it wasn't meant for me. It wasn't meant for anyone. But it wanted me, and as the figure began to turn, its hollow gaze locking onto mine, I knew I had made a terrible mistake by opening that door. The room was suffocating. The pulsating symbols carved into the walls seemed to shimmer and move, as though alive, their faint glow casting grotesque shadows across the empty space. The figure in the center stood unnaturally still, its body a void of rippling blackness that absorbed the faint light rather than reflected it. My instincts screamed at me to turn and run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The air grew colder with each passing second, biting into my skin and filling my lungs with an icy dread that froze my breath. As I stared at the figure, it began to shift. Slowly, it tilted its head toward me, though it had no discernible face. The void where its eyes should have been radiated a darkness that seemed deeper than anything I had ever known. It didn't move closer, but the space between us seemed to collapse, as though the room was folding in on itself. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything but the whispering voices that now surrounded me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and though I still couldn't understand their language, I felt their meaning seep into my mind like poison. They weren't just speaking, they were accusing, condemning. A deep, guttural voice rose above the others, echoing from the figure. It wasn't a voice meant for human ears, a sound so raw and unnatural that it sent a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't be here," it said, the words reverberating in the very core of my being. The figure extended an arm, or what resembled one, and pointed toward the far corner of the room. I turned, my body moving against my will, and saw something I had missed before, a small pedestal holding an object draped in a tattered black cloth. The whispers intensified, their tone shifting to something desperate, almost pleading, as if they didn't want me to approach. But the figure's gesture was unwavering, commanding me to uncover whatever lay beneath the cloth. My feet dragged forward, the ground beneath me feeling like it was crumbling with each step. When I reached the pedestal, I hesitated, my hands trembling as I reached for the cloth. The air around the object felt charged, humming with an unnatural energy that made my skin crawl. As I pulled the cloth away, the room seemed to exhale, the whispers momentarily silenced. Beneath it was a mirror, its surface black and reflective, yet it didn't show my reflection. Instead, it revealed something far more horrifying. The village, seen from above, with me standing at its center, surrounded by shadowy figures. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the mirror, but the figure's voice thundered once again. "Look closer," it commanded. Against every instinct, I raised the mirror to my face. This time, the reflection wasn't of the village, it was of my room, the very place I had fallen asleep. But something was wrong. The bed was empty, the sheets twisted and torn, and the walls were etched with the same symbols that surrounded me now. Panic gripped me as the figure began to move, its form expanding and stretching as though it was absorbing the room itself. The whispers returned, now screaming in unison, their cacophony drowning out my thoughts. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My vision blurred as the room twisted and folded, the walls spiraling inward, pulling me toward the figure. In a final act of desperation, I closed my eyes, hoping to wake up and escape this nightmare. But instead of waking, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. My eyes flew open, and I was no longer in the room. I was back in the village square, surrounded by the shadowy figures from the mirror. Their hollow eyes locked onto me, their mouths moving silently as though chanting something I couldn't hear. And then the figure from the room appeared again, its presence towering over me. This time it didn't speak. It simply extended its hand toward me, palm open, as if offering a choice. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my decision. My mind raced, but before I could act, everything dissolved into darkness. I woke in my bed, drenched in sweat, my body trembling as though I had run a marathon. The symbols from the dream were gone, but the weight of the experience lingered, crushing my chest with its invisible force. I wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, but deep down, I knew the truth. The village wasn't done with me, and whatever I had seen in that room wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was a warning. The morning after the dream, I woke to an unnatural stillness in my apartment. The usual sounds of city life, the faint hum of traffic, the distant chatter of neighbors, were absent, as if the world itself had paused. My body ached, every muscle tight with tension, and my mind raced to process the nightmare I had just escaped. It wasn't just a bad dream. It clung to me like a second skin, its details etched into my memory with a clarity that no ordinary dream should possess. Unable to shake the lingering unease, I turned to the only thing I could do: research. I scoured the internet, typing in every detail I could remember about the village, the fog, the symbols, the oppressive silence. At first, the results were mundane: fictional ghost stories, folklore forums, and conspiracy theories. But then I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A grainy photograph of a village shrouded in mist, its warped houses eerily similar to what I had seen. The caption beneath the image read, "The Lost Village, a place that only appears on moonless nights." The article described a legend that had been whispered across generations, about a village that appeared only when the moon was absent from the sky. According to the stories, those who entered it were never the same, some vanishing without a trace, others returning haunted by something they couldn't explain. The article's description matched my dream in every detail, from the mist that wrapped around your feet to the oppressive silence that made your own heartbeat sound deafening. But what truly unnerved me was the mention of the symbols. The article claimed they were ancient markings, associated with rituals meant to trap or summon spirits. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the glowing carvings on the walls of the room in my dream. The symbols hadn't just been part of the nightmare, they were real. Driven by a growing sense of dread, I searched further, diving into old forums, archived news articles, and forgotten threads buried deep in the web. That's when I came across something that stopped me cold: a handwritten account from a woman who claimed to have encountered the village. Her description of the oppressive air, the shadowy figures, and the sense of being watched mirrored my experience perfectly. But it was her final sentence that sent my heart racing: "I never left the village. Even though I'm awake, I feel its presence everywhere." I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that the dream was more than my mind playing tricks on me. Desperate for answers, I began to dig through my own belongings, searching for anything that could connect me to the nightmare. That's when I remembered my grandmother's journal. She had always been a collector of strange stories and forgotten myths, filling her journals with sketches, notes, and fragmented tales she had heard over the years. Flipping through the worn pages, I froze when I found it: a crude sketch of a village shrouded in mist, nearly identical to the one in my dream. Next to it, in her neat handwriting, were the words, "A place that doesn't belong to this world. Appears on nights without a moon. Beware the door." My hands trembled as I traced the sketch, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. My grandmother had dreamed of this place too. Her notes detailed her own experience with the village, how she had seen it in her dreams as a child, and how it had haunted her ever since. She described the same oppressive fog, the same haunting symbols, and the same figure with hollow eyes that had stood in the room with me. But what struck me most was her warning about the door. She had written, "The door is the key. What lies behind it will either trap you or let you escape. But you must choose wisely." A shiver ran down my spine as I recalled the door in my dream, the mirror that had shown me visions of the village and my own room. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was a connection, a tether between my reality and whatever twisted realm the village belonged to. And now, that tether seemed to be tightening. In the days that followed, the signs grew harder to ignore. The symbols from the dream began to appear in my waking life, etched faintly into the frost on my window, scrawled in chalk on the sidewalk outside my building, even burned into the pages of my grandmother's journal. At first, I thought I was losing my mind, but the sightings were too precise, too deliberate to be coincidence. Then came the voices. Faint whispers at first, barely audible over the hum of my apartment, but growing louder each night. They spoke in the same guttural language I had heard in the dream, their tone both pleading and threatening. I began to feel the weight of unseen eyes on me, their gaze following me even in the brightest daylight. I wasn't alone anymore. The village hadn't just been a dream. It had followed me, seeped into my reality like a dark stain that couldn't be washed away. And as much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew the truth. The nightmare wasn't over. It was only beginning. The whispers in the night became unbearable. Each breath I took felt heavier, laced with a presence I couldn't see, but could feel pressing against me. Shadows in my apartment seemed to stretch longer, their shapes twisting unnaturally when I wasn't looking. Sleep became impossible. Even the brief moments when exhaustion overtook me were filled with flashes of the village, its fog-soaked streets, the glowing symbols, and the figure with its hollow gaze. I knew there was only one way to end this torment. I had to find the village. The decision filled me with dread, but it was unavoidable. My grandmother's journal had provided a clue, a location she believed was tied to the legend, a forest shrouded in mystery, known for the disappearances of hikers and a long-abandoned path that no one dared to walk at night. It was said that on moonless nights, strange phenomena occurred there. The air grew colder, sounds disappeared, and a suffocating mist rolled in without warning. This was where I would find the village, or where it would find me. The night of my journey was starless, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow light. As I approached the edge of the forest, an unnatural stillness greeted me. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just silence, heavy and oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. A faint mist began to creep along the ground, swirling around my feet, and the air grew colder with every step I took. The path was narrow, lined with trees whose branches tangled above me like a twisted canopy, blocking out what little light remained. My flashlight flickered intermittently, its beam cutting through the fog, but revealing nothing beyond endless shadows. Each step forward felt like I was being pulled deeper into a trap, but there was no turning back. I could feel it now, the same oppressive presence from my dream, guiding me towards something unseen. Then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, pulsating like a dying heartbeat. My chest tightened as I moved closer, my steps hesitant yet inevitable. The trees thinned, and the mist grew thicker, coiling around me like living tendrils. The glow became clearer, revealing the jagged rooftops and crooked chimneys of the village. It was exactly as I remembered from my dream, every detail etched in my mind like a scar. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It grew heavier, as though the village itself was aware of my presence. The cobblestones beneath my feet felt warm, pulsing faintly like the ground was alive. The houses stood in silent vigil, their windows glowing faintly with that unnatural light. I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me, watching from every corner, every shadow. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure step out from the mist, a woman, her face pale and strained, her eyes wide with terror. She approached cautiously, her voice trembling as she introduced herself as Evelyn, a historian who had also been drawn here by the village's legend. She looked at me with a mix of relief and fear, as if she was grateful to no longer be alone yet terrified of what we were about to face. Evelyn explained that she had been dreaming of the village for weeks, each night more vivid and horrifying than the last. Her research had led her here, just as mine had. Together, we ventured deeper into the village, our footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. The air grew colder, and the mist seemed to thicken around us, muffling every sound except for the faint whispers that had haunted me since my first dream. As we moved, Evelyn stopped abruptly, her eyes fixed on the ground. There, carved into the cobblestones, were the same symbols that had appeared in my dream. They glowed faintly, their light pulsating in rhythm with the oppressive energy that surrounded us. Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper as she said, "These symbols, they're meant to bind something. Or someone." The realization sent a chill down my spine. This village wasn't just a place, it was a prison. But for what? Or for whom? The answers seemed to lie ahead, where the mist grew darker, thicker, and more alive. The whispers grew louder, their tone more insistent, urging us to stop, to turn back. But something deeper drove us forward, a need for answers, for closure, or perhaps for survival. As we approached the village square, the whispers fell silent. The air became impossibly still, and a single structure loomed before us. The room from my dream, its wooden walls warped and scarred with symbols. The door stood slightly ajar, a faint, pulsing light spilling out from within. Evelyn and I exchanged a glance, our fear mirrored in each other's eyes. "We have to go in," she said, though her voice trembled. I nodded, swallowing the lump of terror that had lodged itself in my throat. Together, we stepped toward the door, knowing that whatever lay beyond it would either provide the answers we sought or consume us entirely. The door creaked open slowly, the sound slicing through the oppressive silence like a jagged blade. The light spilling from within was dim yet pulsating, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. As Evelyn and I stepped inside, the temperature plummeted, and the air became thick, almost impossible to breathe. The room was exactly as I remembered from my dream. The glowing symbols carved into the wooden walls, their faint light shifting as if alive, and the unmistakable sensation that we were being watched. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it lay a dark, featureless mirror. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, reflecting not the room around us, but something far more horrifying. The image in the mirror showed the village, its streets filled with shadowy figures, their hollow eyes glowing faintly as they moved in unison, their mouths silently chanting words I couldn't understand. My stomach twisted as I realized that these were the same figures that had been watching me from the windows, lurking in the corners of my dreams. Evelyn's voice trembled as she whispered, "It's not just a mirror. It's a window." Her words sent a chill down my spine. A window into what? Or worse, into where? The whispers returned, louder and more distinct now, filling the room with their guttural, otherworldly tones. They seemed to seep from the very walls, growing more intense as Evelyn and I moved closer to the pedestal. The air around the mirror warped, rippling like heat waves, and I could feel an overwhelming force emanating from it, pulling at something deep inside me. Before I could stop her, Evelyn reached out to touch the mirror. The moment her fingers grazed its surface, a blinding light erupted, forcing me to shield my eyes. When the light subsided, Evelyn was no longer standing next to me. She was inside the mirror. Her reflection stared back at me, her hands pressed against the glass, her mouth moving in silent screams. I staggered back, my heart pounding as I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. The mirror's surface rippled, and Evelyn's image dissolved, replaced by something even more horrifying. A scene of the village square, where dozens of shadowy figures now stood in a perfect circle, their heads tilted back as if in worship. At the center of the circle was the figure from my dream, its hollow eyes glowing with an intensity that made my skin crawl. A voice thundered through the room, not spoken but resonating directly in my mind. "The village is a doorway," it said, "a threshold between worlds. Those who see it are marked, chosen to decide." The figure in the mirror began to move, stepping forward as if it would emerge from the glass. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen as I watched its hollow eyes lock onto mine. The voice continued, echoing with an unearthly power. "You have entered. Now you must choose. One will stay. One will leave. The village demands balance." The weight of its words crashed over me, and I realized the terrible truth. Only one of us could escape. The other would remain trapped, a part of the village's endless cycle. Panic surged through me as I looked around the room, desperate for a way out. My gaze fell on the symbols carved into the walls, their glow now flickering erratically, as if they were reacting to the presence of the figure. Suddenly, I remembered my grandmother's journal, the warning she had written about the door and the choice it demanded. She had faced this same decision, and now it was my turn. The whispers grew deafening, their guttural tones overlapping in a chaotic chorus that filled my head. The figure stepped closer to the edge of the mirror, its dark form rippling like smoke caught in a storm. Its hollow eyes bore into me, and I felt my body being pulled toward the pedestal, toward the mirror. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the whispers, and reached out instinctively to grab something, anything, that could stop this nightmare. My hand found the edge of the mirror, and in that moment, I felt a surge of icy energy course through me. The room twisted violently, the walls folding inward, the symbols burning brighter until they were seared into my vision. The figure reached for me, its hands stretching impossibly long, and as its fingers grazed my shoulder, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the village square, lying on the cold cobblestones. The shadowy figures surrounded me, their hollow eyes fixed on mine. At the center of the square stood the pedestal, but the mirror was gone. Evelyn was gone. The village was silent, but the oppressive energy remained, pressing down on me like a living thing. Then I noticed something horrifying. The symbols from the room were now etched into my skin, glowing faintly beneath the surface. The whispers had stopped, but I could feel their presence lingering, waiting. I had made a choice, but I didn't know what it meant. The village hadn't let me go. It had marked me, claimed me as part of its endless cycle. And as the mist began to close in around me once more, I realized the truth. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. When I finally opened my eyes, the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room replaced the suffocating darkness of the village. My body felt weak, every muscle trembling with exhaustion, and my skin burned as if branded by fire. The symbols that had glowed beneath my flesh in the village were gone, or at least no longer visible. But the sensation of their presence remained, a faint, pulsing ache that seemed to echo with each beat of my heart. A nurse entered, startled to see me awake. She told me I had been found unconscious in a remote part of the forest, miles from civilization. The rescue team that discovered me claimed they were drawn to the area by strange whispers, though none of them could explain what they heard. They said I had been clutching a tattered notebook in one hand, and when I glanced over at the nightstand beside me, there it was, my grandmother's journal. I flipped through the pages, searching for answers, but they were blank. Every word, every sketch, every warning she had written was gone. The pages were pristine, as though they had never been touched. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the paper, but the weight of what I had experienced was undeniable. The journal had been my guide, but now it felt like a trap, like it had led me into something far darker than I could have imagined. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, a fevered dream brought on by stress or exhaustion. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. My shoes were coated in ash, my clothes reeked of damp earth, and my body bore scratches and bruises in patterns that defied logic. Worst of all were the dreams that plagued me every night, visions of the village, of the shadowy figures watching from the windows, of the mirror that seemed to stare back at me with an intelligence of its own. Then there were the symbols. At first, they appeared faintly in the condensation on my bathroom mirror, disappearing as soon as I wiped them away. Later, I noticed them scratched into the bark of trees during my morning walks, etched into the frost on my car windows, even faintly carved into the walls of my apartment. They were never obvious, always subtle, like the village was reminding me it still had its grip on me. One night, as I lay awake, I heard a faint tapping at my window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there was no logical explanation for the sound. My heart pounded as I approached the glass, my breath fogging the surface as I peered into the darkness outside. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty street below and the faint glow of distant streetlights. But then as I turned away, I caught it, a shadow, faint and fleeting, moving against the fogged glass. The tapping stopped, replaced by whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but their cadence was unmistakable. They matched the guttural tones I had heard in the village, and this time, I understood their meaning. You are marked. You cannot escape. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The village wasn't just a place, it was alive, a force that had claimed a part of me. It had reached beyond its borders, threading itself into the fabric of my reality. And Evelyn, she was gone, lost to the village, her fate a warning of what could happen if I let myself fall too far into its grasp. But the most chilling discovery came days later. I was sorting through the belongings I had carried into the forest, hoping to piece together the fragmented events of that night. Among them, I found a shard of glass, its edges blackened and faintly reflective. It was a piece of the mirror, fractured but still humming with the same energy I had felt in the room. When I held it up to the light, it didn't reflect my face, it showed the village. The mist still clung to its streets, the houses still loomed in silent vigil, and the figures still moved in the shadows, waiting. The shard seemed to pulse in my hand, and for a moment, I felt the air around me grow heavy. My apartment darkened, the walls stretching and warping, and I saw the faint outline of the figure with hollow eyes standing in the corner of the room. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating. And then it was gone, as if it had never been there. I don't know how much time I have left before the village pulls me back. The signs are becoming more frequent, the whispers louder, and the symbols more persistent. The shard of glass remains hidden in a drawer, but I feel its presence like a heartbeat, calling me back to the place where it all began. Was it just a dream? Or was the village real, existing in a space between worlds, a trap for those foolish enough to stumble into its grasp? And why me? Why had it chosen me, marked me, and bound me to its endless cycle? These questions haunt me every waking moment. I don't have the answers, and perhaps I never will. But one thing is certain, the village isn't done with me. It waits, patient and eternal, its mist stretching into the corners of my mind, its whispers promising that the nightmare isn't over. It has only just begun. And now I must ask you, If you had the choice, would you return to uncover the truth? Or would you run, knowing that some doors should never be opened? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes, the nightmares we escape aren't just dreams, they're invitations. And once you've seen the village, you can never truly leave.